Welcome to Human Form and Function. In this first series of lectures, I'm going to cover the human organism. We'll have several different lectures covering anatomy, physiology, structural and functional organization of the human body, basic characteristics of life, homeostasis, and some terminology, as well as the body plan. All of these are important, but the section on homeostasis is one where you are going to want to spend a lot of time. Homeostasis is a key concept for this entire course, for all of physiology. All of these you need to know, of course, but homeostasis may take a little bit longer for you. In this particular video, I'm going to define anatomy and physiology, and then start to talk a little bit about the structural and functional organization of the human body. I'll cover these other things in separate videos. For all the videos, I'm going to give you a list of learning objectives. These will give you an idea of what I want you to be able to do after you watch the videos. These aren't everything you need to know for the exams, obviously, but it's what I cover, what I expect you to get out of the videos. So on the section on anatomy, I want you to be able to define anatomy, describe the different levels at which we can study it, and then explain the relationship between structure and function. For physiology, I want you to be able to define it, and then state the two major goals of physiology. When I get to structural and functional organization of the human body, for that section, I want you to be able to describe each of the 6 levels of organization and tell me a little bit about each level. You'll also need to name the 11 organ systems. You'll need to name and identify their components and then describe the major function of each system. This is a general overview. There's a lot to it still. There's a lot of structures you need to know, but this is just scratching the surface. For each of these systems, we're going to go into a lot of more detail. Each system will have its own chapter, basically. Anatomy is the scientific study that's going to be key for all of these. Remember, scientific study of structure. Literally, it means to dissect or to pull apart. Physiology is a scientific study of the body's function. Anatomy and physiology work together, and it's really impossible to understand one without the other. The two in this course that we cover at the same time will help you see that relationship. Later on, when you take just a gross anatomy and just physiology, you end up, for anatomy, memorizing a lot of stuff. They don't talk so much about function the same way we will in this course. But if you understand the function, it is really going to help you learn and remember that anatomy. Physiology has 2 main goals. One is to understand and to predict the body's response to stimuli. The second goal is to understand how the body maintains internal conditions within a narrow range. This is homeostasis. We'll talk a lot about homeostasis later on, as I said. It's very complex, but it's key to understand, and it's essential for life. We'll talk more about this when we get to this section and homeostasis. There's several different approaches to understanding anatomy. There's a systemic approach. That's the one we're going to use in this course. In a systemic approach, you study by system. So, for example, we're going to study the skeletal system. At the same time we study that, we're going to study the skull, we're going to study the leg bones, we'll study the ribs, we'll study all of these together. In medical school, people use regional anatomy, and here you study the body region. Okay, so when we study the system, we're going to study the skeletal system, which is obviously everywhere in your body. With a regional approach, we'll dissect the shoulder, and what we'll do is look at everything that's there in the shoulder. So we'll look at the muscles, the nerves, the blood vessels, and you'll study all those together. Uh, Regional, the reason medical schools use regional is because we're dissecting cadavers. When you dissect out the shoulder, you don't have the luxury of just studying the humerus, the clavicle, scapula, things like that. You have to study everything that's in there. Because in order to see the bones, for example, you will ruin the muscles and the blood vessels. You can't go back and study it. One thing that's difficult about a regional approach is you are memorizing hundreds of structures, but you may not see how they fit together, how they work, where they're coming from, where they're going to. So the basic knowledge you're going to get in this systemic approach is going to help you understand where the axial nerve is coming from, where it's going, what it does. And that is actually going to help you in the regional anatomy. Now, when we're talking about cadavers, we're going to use dissection. In a clinic, we don't use that. We have two different approaches to studying anatomy in living patients. We have surface anatomy, and we have the use of anatomical imaging. If you're PT, and to a lesser extent OT, you're going to be doing a lot of this. And you'll be doing it by something called palpation. Get used to palpating things. That means feeling for things. So, for example, we can feel the transverse processes along the spine if you know where to feel. Okay, so we can see whether those are damaged, how they align, things like that, simply by palpation. And that's going to be surface anatomy. If we have deeper structures or injury, we'll often use technology to see things. Most common, you're familiar with these: x-rays, ultrasound, things like MRI. Which of these you use is going to depend on what you're looking for. For example, if I'm looking at bone, I'm going to use x-ray. If I want to look at muscle, tendons, things like that, I'm going to use MRI. All of these are important. In this particular class, we are going to use dissection. We're not going to focus on these too much. In your future training, you'll learn a lot more about each of these. Now, for the structural levels of the body, I'm going to run through them here. You might want to look at the figure in your textbook that accompanies this lecture to show you right now. I'll go over it in a minute. The first structure we're going to talk about is a chemical structure. This is the smallest level. Here we're talking about atoms and molecules. So hydrogen, carbon, water, glucose, things like that. Chemicals are going to combine to form cells. These are the basic unit of life. Within the cell, we're going to have lots of different organelles. So we'll have structures like mitochondria, a nucleus, ribosomes. We're going to go over this later in another unit where we talk about the basic structures of cells. So cell is the basic unit of life. These cells are going to combine together into groups called tissues. So tissue is going to be a group of cells that share structure and function. So they kind of do the same things. A tissue not only includes cells, but it includes the space between, the extracellular substance. Later on, we'll cover different types of tissues in a chapter, but things like epithelial cells or epithelium, connective tissue, muscular tissue, nervous tissue. Okay? These are going to be groups of cells with a similar structure and function. Tissues are going to combine to form organs. An organ is going to contain two or more tissue types. Here we can talk about things like skin, heart, stomach. You're familiar with organs. Organ systems are going to be groups of organs that share a similar function. Here we're going to talk about digestive, respiratory, etc. I'll go over the 11 organ systems I want you to know. And when we're talking about humans, obviously, when we put all those organs together, we'll have an organism. Here we're talking about the human organism. There is monocellular life, things like paramecia, you've probably heard of those, or amoebas. Those are single cells. Each of those is referred to as an organism. Okay, so here we're talking about multicellular life. We're talking about the human organism. So when you look at this diagram from the book, here we're talking specifically about human, right? Chemical level. Again, we're going to have different atoms that are going to combine to form structures. Here, for example, we'll have a molecule DNA. These two both together are going to be part of that chemical level. When we get to the cell level, we'll have a specialized structures that will contain organelles, things like mitochondria, nucleus, ribosomes, all of that. We're going to take these cells, and some, like paramecia and amoeba, that's going to be your organism. We're not talking about that in humans, though. In humans, these cells are going to combine together. So let's say these are all important. These cells are all capable of contraction. We'll put those together and we'll form a tissue. So in this case, we're going to have smooth muscle tissue. Okay, so again, similar cells and the surrounding materials that make up the tissues. We're going to take different tissues and organize them together to have organs. In this particular example, the urinary bladder, for example. That urinary bladder has a specific function, which is to hold urine until you expel it. When you look at the structure of the bladder, we're going to have several different types of tissues. So epithelium is one type of tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue. Okay, so you can see we have several different types of tissues combining to form an organ. Several organs are then going to combine to form an organ system. And then several organ systems will make the organism. Okay, so when you look at these, make sure you understand, if I say smooth muscle tissue, I do want you to understand that that's obviously going to be the tissue level. Have a basic understanding of these. We'll talk about all of these in much more detail throughout the course. You do need to know and be able to identify a bunch of different organs. So everything you see here, you will need to be able to identify for the exam. Okay, I'm not going to go list all of these. You probably know all of these organs already. But you can see here we've just got this collection. What we're going to do is take all those various organs and combine them and organize them, classify them based on general function. Okay, so in this particular next set of views, I'm going to show you from APR what the image looks like. And then I'm going to show you the picture from your book and describe the function. Okay, so the integumentary system. Okay, you can see this is everything kind of on the outside. There's a chapter on each of these that will go into more detail. But in general, the integumentary system is going to provide protection. One of the biggest things that the integumentary system does is prevents water loss. We think of your skin as basically keeping stuff out of your body. One of the key functions, though, is it keeps water in. We dehydrate pretty easily. When the skin is damaged, I had a friend who worked on a burn unit, and one of the issues, if they had third-degree burns and the integumentary system, the skin was severely damaged, the person would continuously lose water. There's one patient who had third-degree burns sort of all over their trunk, and literally they had to change the sheets constantly because the water kept oozing out. So you need that skin to prevent water loss. It does other things, helps produce vitamin D, skin, hair, nails, Sebaceous glands and sweat glands are all part of this system. So everything I basically said is what you need to know for the exam. We'll go into more detail in later chapters, though. The skeletal system, again, is going to be the bones. It provides protection and support. It allows body movements. You don't need a skeleton for body movements, as other organisms show us, but we use it as a series of levers and pulleys, basically. That's why you need to learn physics and biomechanics. You need to learn how those levers, which will be the bones basically, and the pulleys, which will be the muscles, work. One key function of the skeletal system that you may not know is it produces blood cells, stores minerals, as well as fat. When we're talking about the skeletal system, we're going to be talking about the bones, also the cartilages. So things like the ACL are going to be part of the skeletal system. Next, we have the muscular system. Muscle is going to be a tissue that contracts. When we talk about the muscular system in the human, we are primarily talking about skeletal or voluntary muscle. Okay, so there's smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle. When we're talking about the muscular system, we're talking about movement. Okay, so skeletal or voluntary movement. It's going to produce body movements, helps maintain posture, and it's also a mechanism for increasing body temperature. Here we're going to talk about muscles attached to the skeletons by tendons. So things like the heart is not going to be part of this muscular system. The lymphatic system, again from APR here, the lymphatic system, you know what that does. That's going to be responsible for the immune system. There's actually quite a few functions. It's going to help remove bacteria, things like that, from the blood and from lymph. It's going to help us combat disease. It's going to help us maintain tissue balance. And a key function too in digestion is it helps absorb fat. It's going to be the lymphatic vessels, lymph nodes, and some other lymphatic organs. This is one unit we're going to skip. So this is basically what you need to know for the rest of the course. The respiratory system is going to be key for oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange between the blood and the air. If the respiratory system isn't working, your cells can't survive without oxygen, and that is obviously lethal. The lungs and the respiratory passages, like the trachea, are going to make up the respiratory system. The digestive system, again, you're somewhat familiar with this already. It's going to perform the mechanical and chemical processes of digestion, absorption, and elimination of waste. So digestion is just breaking things down. Once you break those nutrients down, though, you still have to get them into your body. That's going to be a function, when I say into your body, I mean into your blood. That's going to be a function of the digestive system. And then there's a lot left over, things you can't digest, things your body can't absorb. And the digestive system is going to help you get rid of those. Here we're talking about mouth, esophagus, stomach, intestines, and a bunch of accessory organs. The nervous system is going to be brain, spinal cord, nerves, and sensory receptors. The job of the nervous system is basically to detect changes in the external or internal environment and then coordinate a response to them. In humans, it's also responsible for intellectual function. The endocrine system is going to consist of a series of glands. That includes things like the pituitary gland. That's an important gland. These are going to regulate many different aspects of physiology. They influence things like metabolism, right? The thyroid gland, growth. The pituitary gland releases growth hormone. It's going to influence reproduction, many other functions, blood glucose, things like that. So the endocrine system is going to be a key system. The anatomy is basically is pretty simple, to be honest. The physiology is a lot more challenging, though. We have the cardiovascular system. You already know that that's going to consist of the heart, blood vessels, and the blood itself. The cardiovascular system, its job is to transport nutrients and move waste products to places where you can get rid of them. Things like oxygen, carbon dioxide are going to be carried by the blood. And hormones, which are released by those endocrine glands, are going to be transported throughout your body by the cardiovascular system. The urinary system is going to consist kidney, bladder, the ureters. This is going to remove waste products from the blood. It's going to help regulate blood pH, ion balance, and water balance. These play a key function. Obviously, if you don't regulate water balance correctly, you will not survive. So urinary system, honestly, the physiology of the kidney is not the most exciting thing in the world, but it's critical for life. Anything wrong with the kidneys, they don't function right, you're in big trouble. And then finally, the reproductive system. The other systems are similar in both men and women. Obviously, the reproductive systems are different between men and women. Both of them are going to be responsible for reproduction, obviously. The female reproduction going to produce oocytes, also known as eggs, site of fertilization, and fetal development. Once the baby's born, we're also got to feed that thing, so we're going to produce milk. Some of these functions, obviously, producing milk is going to be specific to mammals. Many species have reproductive systems, but things work a little differently. We're going to focus on the human, obviously, in this course. Okay, so it also produces that milk. You probably already know the structures that make it up. In the male reproductive system, the key is to produce and then transfer sperm to the female reproductive tract. It's going to produce some hormones that help it do those things. And again, you're familiar with these structures here. Okay, so that is a basic introduction to the human organism. Those 11 systems, I went over them pretty quickly, but there's actually a lot to know there. When I showed you those pictures with the different structures on it, you need to be able to identify those structures and recognize that they're part of which system. So, for example, if I say, which system is hair a part of, you need to be able to say the integumentary system. So that's it for this first lecture. I'll continue on about the human organism in the next lecture. Thanks for listening.